Order, please. We'll call a meeting of Public Accounts to order. Remind those in attendance today to place your phones on vibrate or silent, and we'll ask the committee members to introduce themselves, beginning with Ms. Roberts.
Hello, Lisa Roberts, MLA for Halifax Needham.
Good morning, Tim Hallman, MLA for Dartmouth East.
Good morning, Rafa Di Costanzo, MLA for Clayton Park West.
Good morning, Suzanne Lonas-Croft, MLA Lunenburg.
I'm Ben Jessam, the MLA for Hammonds Plains Lucasville.
Morning, everyone. Brendan McGuire, Halifax Atlantic.
Good morning, Hugh McKay, Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you very much. On today's agenda, we have officials from the Office of the Auditor General with us to discuss the May 2019 report. If I could at this time ask the witnesses to introduce themselves, please. Beginning with Mr. Pickup.
Good morning, Michael Pickup, Auditor General.
Good morning, I'm Andrew Atherton, Assistant Auditor General.
Good morning, Adam Harding, Senior Audit Principal.
Good morning, Robert Ewer, Audit Principal.
Ashley Richardson, Audit Principal.
At this moment, if you could make your opening remarks, please.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting us here today to answer questions about our May 28, 2019 performance audit report that I tabled with the Nova Scotia Legislature. That report had 3 separate audits, one on diversity and inclusion in the public service, one on the selection and quality management of bridge projects in Central and Western districts, and one on the Workers' Compensation Board claims management process. Before outlining some of the key messages from these 3 audits, I want to express my thanks to the 6 organizations that we audited. And I'm also very pleased to note that they have made commitments to agree upon and act upon all 27 of our recommendations. I also want to express my sincere thanks to the 36 people in my office for their hard work in completing these audits. While I sit before you today as the Auditor General to explain these audits and answer your questions, it is the efforts of my team that make such valuable work possible. Now I just want to offer a few comments on the 3 audits before I turn it over for your questions. Firstly, on diversity and inclusion. Our audit of diversity and inclusion involved us looking at whether the government has effectively done what it said it would around promoting diversity and inclusion across the public service. We are all, of course, impacted by the public service, and given that the government laid out a strategy to achieve this, called Raising the Bar, a strategy to build diversity and inclusion in the public service, covering 2014 to 2018, I felt it was important to see how well the government was delivering on what it committed to do. And our audit showed that yes, the Public Service Commission, along with the 3 audited departments, Agriculture, Community Services, and Justice, have indeed acted to promote the diversity and inclusiveness of their workforces. Highlights of what has been done include completion of a number of Raising the Bar strategic action items, and both the Public Service Commission and departments have actively promoted diversity and inclusion through various forms, such as departmental committees, policies, and regular communication with staff. While there were certainly positive findings from our audit, I must stress that overall, much work remains to be done for government to achieve its commitment to more effectively promote diversity and inclusion across the public service. Some of the more critical shortcomings of our audit are half of the 16 items in the government strategy that we tested were incomplete, and there was no overall evaluation by the Public Service Commission of whether the goals of the strategy have been met. Similarly, none of the 3 departments we audited had assessed whether their goals on diversity and inclusion were being achieved. And this is critical to assessing the effectiveness of actions and initiatives. Also, the PSC has not adequately identified or collected data on diversity and inclusion in the public service, nor have they evaluated whether the key policies are followed or are effective. And finally, none of the departments were doing a good job tracking whether their staff were taking the mandatory diversity and employment equity training. So in summary, This audit shows that while the Public Service Commission and the 3 select departments have taken steps to promote diversity and inclusion amongst the 11,000 members of the public service, more work is needed if government is going to fulfill its plans. Our audit made 8 recommendations, all of which have been agreed to. Now I will turn to the selection and management of bridge projects at the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. This audit was important to do as Nova Scotians count on bridges being safe and available for use, and they expect due regard for spending of limited public funding. For this audit, we chose the Central and Western districts, which together hold about half of the Government of Nova Scotia's total bridges. Before I talk about the audit findings, let's refresh the numbers. There are 4,200 bridges owned by the Government of Nova Scotia across the province. This includes structures used by vehicles, pedestrians, and cyclists, for example. The Government of Nova Scotia estimates it would require $2.1 billion over the next 10 years to bring these bridges to a desired sustainable condition. That means spending nearly $210 million per year, when current spending is approximately $45 million per year in total to replace, rehabilitate, and maintain the province's bridges. The department also noted that roughly 600 of the province's bridges are rated as being in poor condition, which could include advanced deterioration or fatigue cracks and may need replacement or rehabilitation. Likewise, roughly 1,500 of the province's bridges are rated as being in fair condition, which means sound primary structural elements, but may have some level of deterioration. And finally, the remaining half, or 2,100 bridges, are rated in good condition with only minor problems and likely needing only preventative maintenance. So given the obviously significant difference between the $45 million actually spent each year and the department's estimate of the $210 million per year needed, this audit set out to answer the question of whether the department has adequate systems to allow it to select the right bridge projects and whether, in fact, the work was being completed according to standards. While there are many things that need fixing in how the department manages its bridge projects, I am happy that our audit found that the work carried out on the bridge projects met the standards in place for replacement, rehabilitation, and maintenance work. The department has policies for that work, and they're following them. However, we did identify 4 areas of concern where we noted weaknesses. Firstly, we found that the department's information system is not giving management the necessary information to make decisions on which bridges to replace, repair, and maintain. This is concerning, given that the department operates in an environment where it must make the best use of limited funding that, as noted above, falls short of what they believe they need. Also, management of the department does not have documented criteria to assist them in ranking and selecting projects. Criteria could include information such as bridge condition, bridge usage, other transportation options, and Nova Scotians' overall reliance on bridges. Without defined selection criteria, it is hard for the department to know if they are picking the right bridges to work on. We also noted that while there is a documented inspection policy, the department does not ensure staff follow the policy. For example, 23% of the bridges we selected as part of our audit that needed an inspection in 2018-19 were found not to have inspections done on them. And finally, we noted that warranty inspections were not carried out as required. We found that 75% of the projects we tested did not have a final inspection at the end of the warranty period. This exposes the province to potentially spending more down the road when a warranty claim is missed. So to address the shortcomings in this audit, we made 7 recommendations, and the department agreed with all of them and made commitments to address these issues. So now I will turn to the final audit from the May report. This is the Workers' Compensation Board Claims Management. But before getting into the results of this audit, I just want to make a few comments about the importance of workers' compensation benefits. In any given year, there could be 24,000 workers' compensation claims and nearly $220 million paid out to people under the program. In addition to the overall numbers, is the sheer stress and anxiety of an injured worker focused on getting better and dealing with their financial and economic situation. All of this make this a very important program. In fact, I think it's fair to say that in my 5 years as Auditor General of Nova Scotia, there is no single issue on which my office has received more calls, emails, and interest from Nova Scotians across the province. To those who have contacted us, while our audit doesn't address individual cases, I hope Nova Scotians will find that this audit report is comprehensive and clear in what it says about how the Workers' Compensation Board is managing workers' claims and appeals. I encourage Nova Scotians to read the full audit report and perhaps look at the summary video. Now just a few key audit findings to summarize. Firstly, let me say that our audit found that overall claims and appeals decisions are happening in line with the policies and procedures. So what does this mean? It means the decisions in the files were reasonable, consistent with information available, and had sufficient support on file to justify the decisions made by the Workers' Compensation Board. That is an important starting point, given that when I outline what isn't working well, it can be easy to lose that critical conclusion. So while we found that the Workers' Compensation Board makes decisions in line with program requirements, there is much work to do to improve how it deals with injured workers in Nova Scotia. The things that aren't working well at the Workers' Compensation Board, I think, fall under 5 main categories. 1, the Workers' Compensation Board is not timely in carrying out its work. 2, the Workers' Compensation Board is not consistently providing injured workers with the information they should have. 3, the Workers' Compensation Board is not fully respecting the privacy of confidential medical information of injured workers. 4th, the Workers' Compensation Board is not handling the complaints of injured workers as they should. And finally, the Workers' Compensation Board is not supervising, overseeing, and training caseworkers and staff who handle workers' files as they should be according to their own policy. So given the serious nature of these 5 categories of weaknesses, before I conclude, I'll provide a little more detail. Firstly, on the issue of not being timely, our audit found that in over half of our tests, the written claims decisions were not done within the WCB's 30-day guideline. Secondly, on the issue of not giving injured workers the information they should have, our audit found that in half of our tests, the workers were not given the detailed calculations as to how the benefits were determined. Thirdly, on the issue of not respecting the medical privacy of injured workers, nearly half of our audit tests in this area showed that the employer received medical, medical information not related to the claim, such as other medications and treatments. Fourthly, on not handling workers' compensation complaints well. Surprisingly, the process to handle complaints was so weak, we couldn't determine if all complaints were even recorded by the Workers' Compensation Board. Most of the critical parts of a strong complaints process were not in place, including adequate record keeping and appropriate management review. I think much has to change so that workers' complaints are handled well at the Workers' Compensation Board. Finally, on the Workers' Compensation Board not managing its staff in line with its own policies, we found several significant shortcomings in their practices. For example, lack of required manager review of files, poor tracking of training completion, and incomplete performance reviews of staff. So the Workers' Compensation Board audit report lists many other examples of the above shortcomings. It is clear that the Workers' Compensation Board has some serious work to do to assure injured workers, employers, and all Nova Scotians that they are managing the claims and appeals processing effectively, as all stakeholders should be able to expect of them. We made 12 recommendations, and I am pleased that the Workers' Compensation Board has accepted each of these and has agreed to them with specific and concrete actions to address the recommendations. So in conclusion, I want to, of course, thank you for your keen interest in our work, which is meant to promote better government for Nova Scotians. On a personal note, I want to thank the public sector that we audit, the people who I independently report to in the House, and to current and former members of the Public Accounts Committee and all Nova Scotians for making my first 5 years as Auditor General a wonderful experience. In July, I begin the second half of my mandate, my final 5 years as Auditor General, and I look forward to continuing to serve with a team that delivers consistently and makes my job much easier than it would be otherwise. I want to thank all the past and present Office of the Auditor General of Nova Scotia team members. It has been a pleasure, and now we would be happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, sir. We'll now pass questions over to the PC Caucus and Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. Mr. Pickup, thank you for your opening remarks, and thank you to the staff of the Auditor General for the May 2019 audit. My line of questioning will begin with Chapter 2 on infrastructure. With respect to Chapter 2, certainly it grabs your attention. It raises a lot of red flags in terms of perhaps the public confidence in our infrastructure. One of the, statements from Chapter 2 that grabbed my attention was the following. Systems do not provide, and quote, systems do not provide adequate information needed by management to make decisions about what bridges to fix and when to fix them, end quote. I'm of the belief, and I'm sure my colleagues are as well, that I think Nova Scotians expect the Department of Transportation to be able to make informed decisions, to put in place decisive action plans, to address these bridges. We know there are 4,200 bridges that we have in this province, and 600 have been classified in poor condition. Do you believe government should release the names of those 600 bridges in the name of transparency? Mr. Pickup.
So a couple of comments on that, and I think, I want to stress again that in terms of a classification of bridges as being poor and the descriptor around what a poor bridge is, that really does come from the department in terms of what that means. But one of the things I certainly learned on this audit was that a poor condition bridge does not mean necessarily something that is unsafe or something that we shouldn't use as a pedestrian, a cyclist, or a motorist. In terms of the level of significance of within that category of poor, you have different ratings. So poor doesn't equal poor equals poor. There are different levels of poorness in there. So, I guess in terms of if members think that that is something that they want and want to address that to the department in terms of what they want to know about that, I guess I do have to leave that between members and the department. For us, the audit conclusions around the systems and the significance of the findings, were there and we concluded without necessarily needing to identify which of the bridges that is. But of course, that doesn't say that is not to take away from whether or not you want to know which bridges they are, and I would leave that to you to pose to the deputy.
Mr. Holman. The course of your audit, what did you discover in terms of how the department classifies the term poor bridges? What's the criteria that you discovered that's used to come up with that descriptor? Mr. Pickup.
Sure. So if I could refer you to our Appendix 2 on page 43 of the report. So the description that the department uses as something that is a poor bridge is a bridge that may have advanced deterioration or fatigue cracks, and that these structures, these bridges, commonly need either rehabilitation, which is more than maintenance, or in fact need replacement. And within that category of the ratings would be 4 or less. So that is the descriptor that we used in the appendix 2 on page 43. But again, those aren't our words; those are how the department, what the department describes them as.
Mr. Hallman.
And certainly, based on that description, in the course of your audit, do you believe it's a logical conclusion that urgent action is required to deal with those 600 bridges classified as poor? I mean, it certainly raises red flags. It certainly grabs your attention.
Mr. Pickup.
So I think in terms of, again, we're trying to make the point on this audit that the audit findings are very important. Okay, so in determining in a limited resource environment which projects you're going to do, making sure the systems capture the information that you need, that is critical so that you're picking the projects that you want to pick. Now, having said that, the thing that I was reminded of during this audit that, while intuitively it can seem that poor condition might mean one thing, to somebody on the street, for example, that to the department, poor means something very specific. So I think having a discussion around that, but I think I would go back to sort of some of the findings in the audit and saying, for example, where we found in some cases where the inspections were not done, or in fact some of the projects had not been put forward. I think it's much easier to deal with those specifics than it is to deal with sort of a population of 600 bridges and what those 600 bridges mean.
Mr. Hallman, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Department of Transportation indicated that it needs $2.1 billion over the next 10 years to reduce the current bridge infrastructure debt. It's a huge amount of money. If I understood the report correctly, the department's spending $45 million a year for upkeep of that infrastructure. In order to achieve that $2.1 billion over 10 years, that would translate, as you know, into $210 million a year required to achieve the current rate of replacement and the current rate of maintenance. I'm curious, how long would it take for an audit to be done to verify the accuracy of the department's estimate of $2.1 billion?
Mr. Pickup.
So we just I want to make sure I clarify the question. But so in this case, the $2.1 billion deficit that they put forward that we indicated that we didn't audit was for contextual information, right? Because we certainly are not, and it's not the Auditor General's place to suggest how much should be spent. We are dealing with the environment that we have. So we didn't attempt to say that $2.1 billion should be $1 billion or it should be $3 billion. What we use that as contextual information, and that did not impact any conclusion. It was just to context the importance of doing this, given that you're not spending anywhere near what you said you would to get to it, you would like to get to a desired sustained condition. So we didn't audit that $2.1 billion, if I understood the question correctly.
Mr. Hallman.
Let me rephrase, Mr. Pickup. How long would it take, if you did an audit on that $2.1 billion, how long would it take for that audit to be done to verify the accuracy of that $2.1 billion?
Mr. Pickup.
I think it would depend on the quality, and I hate giving one of these it depends answers, but it really would depend on the quality of the underlying information and what we were trying to do. So if we were trying to ensure that an estimate was fully accurate, that it was complete, we would again go back as a starting point to say, okay, where is this information coming from? How reliable are the systems this is coming from? And that's partially why we didn't attempt to audit that information, because we didn't use that as an audit conclusion. It was really just contextual information. So it would very much depend on the circumstances that you're in. And I don't know enough to know in this case, because we didn't attempt to get there, of what the quality of the information systems, the calculations, because we know that coming up with a number like this, it could be the result of limited amount of work, or it could be very detailed, very extensive work, and that would drive how long it would take to do an audit of that.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In section 2.5, it states that the department does not have a process to centrally record work completed on bridges, even though the department's information system is capable of recording maintenance history. How long do you think it should take the department to develop and implement a process of centrally recording work completed on bridges?
Mr. Pickup.
So to go to that point, you know, the infrastructure, if you will, the system is there. So the recommendation that we made is review your processes and systems and take action to ensure that the information is recorded. So I would actually look at the response here and say, okay, what did the department say? So they said they're going to review these processes and systems, and they're going to look at potential software upgrades, including policies and procedures. They say they will get it done within 24 months. They say they were going to hire a maintenance planner who will prioritize this stuff, and that they'll have that up and running within 6 months. So I think there's two key deliverables there, that they indicate they're going to get somebody in 6 months, and then that person will come in, and then some of this other work will be done within the 24 months.
Mr. Hallman.
So with respect to staff who are only trained to complete a level 1 inspection, they can create a record indicating that a level 2 inspection occurred. Can you explain the difference between a level 1 and a level 2 inspection with respect to bridges, and what issues arise in terms of, I guess, the differences between the level 1 and level 2 inspections?
Mr. Hardy.
Thank you for the question. In terms of inspections, a level 1 inspection and a level 2 inspection as well are both visual inspections of the bridge. So a level 1 inspection is being completed typically by an area manager or an area supervisor within the department. They've received a 2.5-hour training session within the department. And the inspection itself is really designed as a visual look at the bridge. So once a year, they go out and they're to look at all the bridges across the province. And they're looking really for any safety concerns. They're looking for any structural concerns. They're looking at different components of the bridge itself. And it's really to identify if there's anything that needs to, any further action needs to be taken. So that's really a level 1 inspection. It's a very general, just a visual. I go out, I look at the bridge. It could take an hour, it could take 2 hours, depending on the bridge and where it is. A level 2 inspection is a more involved, it's a more in-depth visual inspection. They're looking at the same type of components, but they're looking at it in a much more involved way. You might, for example, use an underbridge inspection vehicle to help see components up close. You may have to close down traffic to be able to access all the components of the bridge to be able to complete your inspection. So they can take longer. It could take several hours to a day or perhaps longer depending on the bridge and where it is. So again, the level 2 inspections are also taking place on a different interval. It's usually between 2 and 6 years, depending on the road that the bridge is on, the type of bridge, and the condition of the bridge. So the department has their own policies around that as to how often they will inspect those bridges. But predominantly, they're both visual inspections to identify any obvious concerns or things that they need to take further action on.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you for that clarification. With respect to, where management is perhaps having difficulty, to determine what bridges to fix and when to fix them. In the course of your analysis, is this where the gaps exist between the level 1 and level 2 inspections? How problematic is this in terms of being able to trigger action to be taken to address the structural issues of a bridge?
Mr. Hardy.
I guess in terms of the overall audit, I don't know that I can comment on whether the difference between level 1 and level 2 led to any specific concerns in terms of the structure of a bridge. Again, we were looking at the inspection process and how that feeds into the quality of a bridge and knowing the condition of the bridge. But in terms of whether that led to any particular structural issue, if I understand the question correctly, I wouldn't have any comment that way.
Mr. Hallman.
In the course of your analysis, does this system that's in place, the level 1, level 2 inspection, what measures of accountability did you discover in terms of the inspections? Like who's recording what, who's putting in data? Like, are there mechanisms of accountability built into that inspection process?
Mr. Pickup.
I think in response to that and partially response to your previous question, I want to bring us to paragraph 2.23 and paragraph 2.24 because I think it partially addresses what you're talking about, or maybe more than partially. The inspection, here's where we talk about the inspection policies don't define a time frame to complete a follow-up inspection if there are issues during a level 1 inspection or when a level 2 verification requires a new level 2. And so we indicate that without those established and monitors timeframes, there's a risk that inspectors will not identify and correct issues. So I think that goes to the importance actually of monitoring and doing something with both of these level 1 and 2. And then I think the other part of that is in paragraph 2.24 is that the department doesn't have a monitoring process in place. So this is where accountability comes in, because to me accountability relates to you need to monitor to hold people accountable. So a first step in that I think would be having a monitoring process in place over the data, and that would deal with, for example, as we noted, there are errors and various levels of information. So I hope that helps context your question.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How much time do I have?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, all right. So it was noted that 28 bridges of the 2,100 were determined to be ones that should be removed from the information system because either the bridge was closed or the structure didn't meet the department's definition of a bridge. I'm curious, is it your impression that these structures were counted when the department made its $2.1 billion estimate for its 10-year forecast?
Mr. Harney.
We wouldn't have looked specifically at what bridges were included in the department's $2.1 billion estimates, so we don't have that. But my understanding is they use the information from their information system. So from that, I would presume that those bridges would have been included since they were in the information system and that formed part of what they would have used when they did that analysis.
Mr. Hallman.
The report mentions 6 bridges, which were either municipal bridges or bridges owned by other parties. The issue being that it was not clear as to who the owners were, and the unfortunate result could be in which neither party is inspecting these bridges to ensure that they are safe for public use. I suppose the fear, of course, is the diffusion of responsibility. Where were these bridges located at? Those 6 bridges where you weren't sure who was responsible?
Mr. Harney.
For those 6 bridges, they were all located in the Western District. I don't have the specific location for each of them, but they were all within that one district.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the course of your analysis, did your office figure out who the owners were before the report was finished?
Mr. Harney.
We did not go that step to determine who was responsible for those particular bridges. Again, some of these bridges would be either owned by municipalities or private parties, and it would be a matter of what agreements were in place, whether historically when they were created. So we didn't get into who was responsible for that or try to determine ourselves.
Mr. Hallman.
Did the department make any promises to figure out the details of ownership for these bridges?
Mr. Harney.
Just quickly rereading their response to that recommendation there. We didn't specifically ask them, I believe, for an action in regard to those bridges, but once the issue was identified to them that it was unclear on these bridges, my understanding was that they were going to be continuing to look at who was responsible for those structures.
Mr. Pickup.
Sort of, and maybe in fairness to the department, that would be a question if you do have the deputy minister here at some point to find out what happened, because it's also the time of the audit. But I mean, lots of time has gone by after that perhaps something was done.
Mr. Hallman.
With respect to that, Mr. Pickup, I'm curious, did the department provide any excuse or rationale for taking so long in finding out the details of ownership? Was there any explanation given?
Mr. Pickup. Mr. Hardy. Mr. Hardy.
Not necessarily specific to these 6 bridges, but in general, when we were discussing and clearing the report with the department, they had mentioned that there are a number of bridges, whether it be municipal that the ownership historically had been with municipalities and a transition to the department or vice versa, and that as part of that, there were some bridges where the ownership of them, it wasn't as clear in terms of the agreements that had been signed and the historic records that had been signed as to where those currently sit. So some of that is, I believe, I don't want to say a negotiation, but they have to revisit the particular bridge and the particular agreements that were signed or in place historically to see where this one falls. Some of these bridges are on transportation right-of-ways where they may or may not be responsible for maintenance and inspection, or the municipality may be, depending on that current ownership. So it wasn't specific to these 6 bridges, but in general, a lot of it is from the historic of what was once responsibility of one party and is shifted to somebody else, and what responsibilities still remain with them.
Mr. Hallman.
Within the scope of your professional judgment, how concerned should the public or the Department of Transportation be with respect to bridges not being properly inspected due to unclear ownership?
Mr. Pickup with 30 seconds.
I would put that finding under the same bucket as all of the findings in this audit and all of the recommendations in this audit, that they all are important to do to ensure you have the information, you are using the information, and you are making the best use of limited public funding that you can. So I think all of these are important, and I think the responses to the recommendations, I believe, reflect that, because the responses, a lot of them are around a 6-month window, a number of them are around a 12 to 24-month window, so they don't indicate that they're going to take years to respond, which I hope is a reflection of the value and importance of the recommendations and the findings to the department.
Thank you, Mr. Pickup. That concludes PC Caucus time. We'll now move to the NDP Caucus. Ms. Roberts.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with the first chapter in this audit report related to equity and diversity in the public service of Nova Scotia. And just, I'll say that it's certainly concerning that that when you tested 16 strategic actions, the finding was that 8 of them were incomplete, and those were strategic actions that were decided on in, if I understand correctly, in 2014. And I was just looking through the strategic actions that the public service, set for itself, and just for an example, in order to equitably represent the public we serve at all levels of the workforce, there was a commitment, or a strategic action item, to develop and implement a diversity recruitment strategy to support recruitment of underrepresented groups. The Auditor General tested that and found that it was incomplete. Another strategic action was to increase participation of underrepresented groups on hiring panels, and that was tested, and it was found to be incomplete. I'm very curious to know if you tested all 32, which of those are complete, and obviously that's work that has to, be committed to and be done continuously, but it is somewhat concerning. Well, it is concerning, not somewhat, that so many of those strategic actions, having been decided on, were not pursued. So in the report, you note that implementation and evaluation plans were developed by the Public Service Commission with an external consultant during the process of developing the diversity and inclusion strategy. However, the Public Service Commission did not use the implementation or evaluation plans. In the course of your work, was there any rationale provided for why the implementation and evaluation plans were developed but then not actually used?
Mr. Jewer.
Yeah, I think that's. I really think that's a better question for the Public Service Commission when they're here. It's not something we focused on, whether or not they were in place, whether or not they were used, and didn't really dig into the reason why.
Ms. Roberts.
In the response to the audit, did the Public Service Commission offer any assurances that this will be corrected for the new strategy that is currently in development?
Mr. Pickup.
So I did just want to say part of why we did this audit now is because the strategy was a 2014 to 2018 strategy. So we thought enough time had gone by that it made sense to do this. Also, particularly, we want to be useful. And I think besides giving assurance to the House on the things that were done, it was a good opportunity to provide an audit result to the Public Service Commission. So in their response, in their overall additional comments on page 22 of the report, they indicate that they are going to use this report as they develop the new diversity and inclusion strategy and as they revise some of their key policies as well. I think beyond that, in terms of specifics, you know, as to how some of this is going to roll out and what they're going to do with it, you know, as Mr. Dewar said, probably better off for the Public Service Commissioner.
Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. The Auditor General's office found that the Public Service Commission does not have an adequate process to identify and collect diversity and inclusion data. Can you provide some examples of the type of data that is needed and not currently, you know, collected and kept track of?
Mr. Dewar.
I mean, I think it's, again, you know, our work there was, our recommendation there is really focusing on that it's up for the PSC to figure out what data they need. I don't think we're in the best position to actually tell them what they should be getting. You know, I mean, I think one example is one of the strategic actions that wasn't completed, increased participation in underrepresented groups on diverse hiring panels. I think that's an example of somewhere where you can't really assess whether or not you've completed that unless you've captured data on how frequently these hiring panels are being used. But in terms of more detail and more specific types of things they should be getting, I really think that's a better question for the Public Service Commission.
Ms. Roberts.
I know that in addition to looking at the Public Service Commission, you also looked at 3 separate departments. So just so I'm clear, when a strategic action was found to be incomplete, what does that mean across those 3 departments in addition to the Public Service Commission?
Mr. Dewar.
The strategic actions were really things that like PSC had the lead on. So I guess if you look at it from the perspective of the Public Service Commission is the kind of the lead human resources agency for the province of rolling policies out. There could be some implication of if things aren't put in place, departments may not have those resources, but again, it's not something that we saw any direct implication in PSC not doing this in terms of the work or the things that was going on in the department.
Ms. Roberts.
Okay, and so then in the case of other strategic actions, like, is it possible that in one particular department there was some extra initiative taken, but that's not necessarily captured or coordinated by the PSC, or?
Mr. Dewar.
Sorry, I'd say that's a fair comment. You know, the PSC definitely takes a lead on these things, but departments still have flexibility to take on things that they want to pursue or things they feel appropriate.
Mr. Roberts.
Okay,
Mr. Pickup, sorry.
I was just going to give a quick comment that in paragraph 1.36, for example, we try to give some specific examples of some of the things that the departments are doing. For example, communication as an example. So we did look at things that the department were in fact doing beyond the things that were in the strategy and that may have been the role of PSC. And that is why we included 3 departments in this, because it's very much the departments who are leading folks.
Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. One of the reporting tools the government does have for collecting data is the How's Work Going annual employee survey. In the report from 2017, employees were asked to respond to the statement, quote, "I am treated respectfully at work." and responses show that between 2015 and 2017, the results on that question in Department of Community Services, Justice, Agriculture, and the Public Service Commission got worse. Employees in all these groups were less likely to say that they were treated respectfully at work in 2017 than they were in 2015. Based on your review, do you have any thoughts on why the government would be doing worse on that measure? Why the trend would be going in the wrong direction?
Mr. Jewer.
No, again, I'm sorry if I sound like I'm passing things off to the individual departments. I mean, I think that's really something when those results come out, that that's something that you'd have to really ask the departments as to what may be contributing to the decline in those results.
Mr. Pickup.
I just want to add something quickly. You're referring to the publicly available departmental individual disaggregated information that is available, and that is something to be completely transparent. That is something that informed our thought processes on why we wanted to do this audit, as well is reading some of these things. Not that we made a direct correlation between that and this, but it does inform us from an inherent risk perspective on the environment that we face. So we are aware of that.
Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. And I wonder, Mr. Pickup, I'm always aware of the mandate of this committee, which is to examine, the expenditure of public dollars and whether we're getting value for money for the work that we undertake. And sort of as a no longer that new but still newer politician, one of the things that I've been struck at is that the number of times that I hear about reports or strategies that have been developed, in this case, we know that an external consultant was engaged, to work with public servants. And then it seems that we often don't get the value for money because somehow the political energy or the political commitment, or is it not political, but somehow within the public servants service is not, it doesn't stick with the project through the implementation. So here's a strategy that was developed in 2014, and yet in 2018 we see that half of the actions weren't complete, according to the ones that you tested. Is that I guess to you as an Auditor General of concern, given the expenditure of both public dollars, but also, if you could calculate it, the time of public servants that went into this and for which we haven't seen the results?
Mr. Pickup.
Part of why we picked this audit, and if you look at this report where we're looking at bridges, we're looking at workers' compensation, we're looking at diversity and inclusion, because to me, this area as an audit is as important as any of those other areas that we audit, and that is partially why we included it. Partially why we included it is if the government didn't have any policies here, if it didn't have a strategy, if it didn't have an approach, there wouldn't be much to audit. The fact is the government laid out a very extensive plan, a very extensive strategy, which very much lends itself to audit. Having said that, I think I've been fairly clear in balanced, fair reporting to say there's a lot left to do. However, you did do some things. I mean, so I think it's, it's up for individuals, I think, to judge, I guess, is doing half of the items we tested, do you think that's reasonable or not reasonable? What we've said is that at the end of the day, you didn't do, half of what you said you were going to do, and you didn't do a lot of other things, recognizing you did a number of these things over here. So we're trying to be very, clear to the audit purpose, clear to the audit objectives. Yes, it is concerning. Is it as important as anything else in terms of the expenditure of public resources? And you refer to managing 11,000 public servants here, but I would also suggest that part of the importance of doing this is in the government's own strategy is that as these 11,000 public servants deliver services to Nova Scotians want a public service that is diverse and inclusive and reflects them as well. So it's not just, this is not just sort of, inside baseball and internal to government. This is very much, impacting, and that is partially why we selected this audit.
Ms. Roberts.
Thank you very much. I appreciate those comments. I am going to move to bridges, perhaps for the rest of my time. I was struck at the gap between what is currently budgeted and spent on replacing, rehabilitating, and rehabilitating bridges and what the department itself estimates would be required to get all the bridges to a desired and sustainable condition. So the department spends approximately $32 million annually, as well as $13 million to replace and rehabilitate, as well as $13 million to maintain. And yet, in January 2019, the department estimated that $210 million per year is needed on an annual basis over the next 10 years to get the bridges to a desired and sustainable condition. Just give me a sense of whether that is, I guess, remarkable to you. To me, it's remarkable. If I knew that I was like kind of operating at an annual deficit of what I needed to spend on maintaining, my home or my car, that would be alarming to me. So should that be alarming to us as Nova Scotians?
Mr. Pickup.
So why we put that contextual information in there is, again, to stress the importance of, in a world of limited resources where you have to choose what you are doing, then your key systems, your processes have to work so that you are making well-informed choices. You're making the decisions that that you want to make. So that was the importance of the contextual information. The numbers themselves don't tell a story beyond, okay, what does that mean? So what does that difference between 210 million and 45 million mean in terms of impacts, in terms of risk management? And that is probably a fairly in-depth discussion that really you probably want to put that to the deputy minister. But again, I thought it was important contextual information, including on the number of bridges.
Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. In the legislature, I feel like there's a couple of bridges that I want to actually travel over. I keep hearing about the Seal Island Bridge, for example, in Ilma Dam, because it comes up so often in question period. So that's one of the bridges that was not maintained and is now maybe being replaced. But there are real impacts for Nova Scotians when a bridge is allowed to deteriorate to a condition that it needs to be closed for a period of time. And we hear of circumstances in the legislature where, a bridge is closed and it's not because it's being replaced at that moment. It's not just for a replacement period. It's because of a period where it is not safe to travel. And we have ambulances and other emergency, services having to take extensive and lengthy detours. So, and often a response when questions are raised around particular bridges is presented in the House. Often the response from the minister is a reference to how Nova Scotia has a very extensive road network, that this is kind of also part of the context for this challenge, that we have, I grew up in Newfoundland. There's only ever one way to get anywhere. Like, we put in roads so late that there's only ever one road that will get you to any particular place, whereas in Nova Scotia, actually, there's quite a grid, and I've driven on some roads where I'm on pavement and I'm straddling the yellow line and both of my tires are, like on the edge of the crumbling asphalt on either side. And that's, part of our 200 series, 300 series highways. But I'm wondering if, in the context of this audit, you have a sense of whether we are balancing accurately the demands on maintaining a road network which was built out and which actually connects communities with, continuing to invest in new elements to a road network, which are, more so the 100 series highways. Are we doing the right balance of adding to our assets and actually maintaining our current road network?
Mr. Pickup.
The short part of that answer is I think that is a question, better posed to the department. The longer add-on to that answer is I do very much want to refer you to paragraph 2.10 and 2.11 on page 33. Is that given the situation we have in terms of the funding is what the funding is, and that's the world that we're auditing in, that we note the management didn't have documented criteria to rank and assess projects, including some of the things you're referring to: bridge condition, traffic volume, travel time to the nearest detour, whether the bridge is on a main route for emergency vehicles. So we conclude without those criteria, it's impossible to assess decisions made and creates a risk they may not identify bridges with the highest priority. So I think that, I don't want us to lose that point, because no matter what the split is between capital, maintenance, no matter what that split is, those 2 points are critical, whether you're spending $35 million or some other number, that you're doing those things.
Ms. Roberts, 30 seconds.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry, 30 seconds. I would just ask, see now I had a question in my mind and the 30 seconds completely drove it out of my mind. I'm sorry. I'm gonna pass on to the Liberals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll pass down the Liberal caucus to Ms. Sloan-Scroft.
Thank you and good morning. Congratulations on your halfway point of being Auditor General here in Nova Scotia. And one of the things I have enjoyed the videos that you do, and I think they're good starting points for us as MLAs, but I think it's more important that they're very friendly for our taxpayers and citizens of Nova Scotia, to make them more aware, and it's in easy language and whatnot. Maybe we can do a video sometime on a day in the life of an auditor, because sometimes I'm really curious of how you actually go in and do an audit. And I'm sure with every department, it has to be done differently because of the settings and whatnot. So I'm sort of interested in, and I'll talk about Chapter 1 with the mandatory diversity training. Can you explain more about how this mandatory training takes place in the public service?
Ms. Richardson, or Mr. Jor, sorry.
Sure. It's a classroom-based session delivered by facilitators from the Public Service Commission. It's included. I think there's a group of training courses that's pretty much when everyone starts within the public service that everyone's required to take, and diversity and employment equity is included in one of those. Included as one of those.
Ms. Sloan-Scroft.
Does it take place over a period of time, like so many sessions in a month period or whatnot, or is it like a one day and done training?
Mr. Jor.
Yeah, it is a one day session.
Ms. Sloan-Scroft.
And would there be follow-up sessions?
Mr. Jor.
That was one of the points you can make in the report. Is it's a little bit unclear as to whether or not that training needs to be repeated at regular intervals. I believe we mentioned the employment equity policy, which outlines the requirement for people to complete this training, is silent on that. The guidelines that accompany the policy suggest it be completed every 3 to 5 years. Depending on some of the individuals we spoke to, I think there were some mixed views as to whether or not. Generally, I think most people indicated it didn't need to be completed. So that was one of our findings, and I think if points just to one of the recommendations, recommendation 1.6. We do include a comment there. Policy guidance should also be developed to include timeframes for when training should be completed and whether it needs to be retaken at regular intervals.
Ms. Lawrence-Craft.
And how much of that was included inclusive language?
Mr. Jewar.
I can't really comment on that. It's not something, we didn't look at the kind of the makeup of the training to see if it did include inclusive language.
Ms. Lawrence-Craft.
So were you able to look in, like, do their policies include inclusive language?
Mr. Jewar.
Again, that's not something we looked at.
Ms. Lawrence-Craft.
Okay. Okay. I just find that interesting because language is something we use every day, and language is very powerful and determines very much people's inner views of gender equality too. And you know, I hear you guys a lot, even by people in government a lot. And there's colloquialisms that we use in our everyday language that without diversity language, inclusive language training, you know, people continue to use that language, and it has to be practiced on a daily basis, as is the writing has to be practiced on a daily basis to really ingrain it, because people have lived their lives using certain languages and that today are not always acceptable, especially in the workplaces. Were you able to sit in on any training sessions?
Mr. Pickup.
I just don't want to let too many points go before I jump in and respond, if that's okay. So a couple of things. I think, you know, if you have a chance to get the Public Service Commissioner here, and those are things that interest you, perhaps, you know, an advance note to her indicating, you know, you'd like a little bit of information on these types of things. I'm sure she would be able to provide that either in advance or when she comes. Secondly, on your point on the videos, thank you so much for your feedback. You know, we appreciate that feedback. We're here to serve the House, so anything we can do to help MLA serve, we appreciate. Thirdly, on the issue of the training, what we did, something like over 90% of our folks have already taken the training. The last 4 people are on a wait list. We did it together. So I went with most of the staff and we did the full day training together. And you know, certainly there are incremental benefits to that. It's not only the training that you're taking and the discussions and the breakout sessions that you're having, but it's just the learning about each other and the collegiality. So we have taken that, and I know, just having been in on that, that those courses do address some of the issues, but I think for a more wholesome answer, rather than me trying to sort of pick parts of it and reflecting back on when I took it, probably a question to the Public Service Commissioner. I also think, you know, that's probably a worthwhile question if you have a chance to have the Deputy Ministers in here from the department. How are they tracking those courses? Are they taking them? Are they ensuring that their staff are taking them as well?
Ms. Lawrence-Craft.
Thank you for that information. I want to talk about Chapter 2. You referred to the TIR information system as not giving management the necessary information to make decisions. Can you expand on that?
Mr. Hardy.
Thank you. Thank you for that. In terms of the information system, some of the items that aren't included that we reference in the report here would be things like information about the bridge in terms of, is it like length of detour, for example, would be information that may help management make decisions when it comes to the condition of a bridge and which bridges to replace. Other examples are the condition of the bridge. They do have the inspection information within that system, but that's just one element when you're considering, do we do X bridge or do we do Y bridge? Some of the other examples, I believe that we, some of the other information would be traffic volume as well.
Mr. Pickup.
So if I can just add, of course, I'm not out there with the audit team, and they know much more of the details than me, but I'm fairly involved. And one of the things that struck me, when we started talking about the audit findings, if I bring you to paragraph 2.6 and the last couple of sentences, and it was sort of a bit of an aha moment when we talked about that, when the team told me that when they reviewed inspections files, it was difficult to determine which repairs related to which deficiency or the action the department took to address the deficiency. So I'm like, how can that not be happening? So I think that those are some pretty striking examples of some of the deficiencies.
Ms. Lawrence-Croft.
Okay. We have the TIR call center for road conditions, which also includes bridges. Did you look at the stats coming from that center to determine how much public reporting of, a lot of the information I get comes from the public. I get constituents who call me and talk about many of the, the road conditions, especially bridges in their area. That's how I become informed. This is a way for the department to come informed. Did you check that means of communication?
Mr. Pickup. Mr. Pickup.
I'm waiting for the short answer to that is no. Mr. Harding will correct me, but I'm pretty sure it's a no. But the equally important aspect of that answer is that is something that could potentially be a criteria. So if we go to paragraph 2.11, for example, 2.10 and 2.11, and we say, when you're looking at these, which projects to do and how you determine where you're going to spend your limited amount of money, you need to have criteria in place, and criteria could include bridge condition, traffic volume, travel time, which perhaps, and the department could respond to this for you, perhaps one way to inform those types of things is call center information, as an example. But I think a first step, rather than gathering all the information, is to have the criteria in place to know what you want to look at to make those decisions.
Ms. Lawrence-Croft.
Okay, because they are keeping statistics of, volume of calls, the number of where the incidents are, how they're, and the response time too is all part of that. So I think it would be a good place to check, because a lot of our information does come from the public. I know it came up earlier about the roads that weren't, the bridges that weren't identified, but I can tell you in my area, and subdivisions are privately owned often, and so those bridges are the responsibility of the owners. Also, many belong to municipalities, and it's their responsibility for maintaining bridges, as is the road maintenance and winter and summer maintenance programs. So. And there is a lot of confusion over that. A lot of, although people buy, when they buy, they are told there are covenants that include that. A lot of bridges don't get reported their maintenance until they're at a point of needing so many repairs. And then when the homeowners are all asked to chip in, it becomes an issue, and sometimes it's the want of the people to have the province make the repairs when it's actually privately owned. But I've come across that many times in my work. Also, Chapter 3, you mentioned that workers' compensation are the most frequent calls to your office. I'm just wondering, are there jurisdictions in the province that are more of your complaints come from?
Mr. Pickup.
So I wouldn't categorize them necessarily as complaints. I would call them as people expressing interest with us, encouraging us to look at things, sharing their stories with us. I couldn't give you a complete geographic breakdown because what was most important for us was the extraction of the issues from any of the correspondence or calls that we received rather than where it was coming from. All right, so we didn't necessarily say, well, we're getting this many from this part of the province, this many from this part. We looked at, okay, are we getting most of the inquiries? Are they related to timing? Are they related to completeness of information? What are they actually related to? So it was more issue-driven than geographic.
Ms. Lones-Croft.
Are you finding there are particular areas where the delays fall in certain cases?
Mr. Pickup.
So what we reported here is for example, the claim decision. So if the Workers' Compensation Board wants to get the claim decision within 30 days, half of what we tested didn't get out within the 30 days.
Ms. Lones-Croft.
So that seems to be the biggest issue that you have heard?
Mr. Pickup.
The timing of the decision, the delay in decision making?
Mr. Pickup.
So that was an audit finding. So all of those sort of calls we get, information we receive, that is just one thing that informs us, and that helps inform us to sort of from the initial stage to say, okay, let's look at a few other things here, and is this important to audit? Once we decide to do an audit, like at the Workers' Compensation Board, then we go in and say, what types of things should we look at? That may include the things we receive phone calls on. It may include other things as well that we identify as important. For example, we did Workers' Compensation Board Audit Phase 1 that we reported some time ago that looked at sustainability of the funding, right? So looked at the financial condition of the fund. Frankly, we didn't get a whole lot of phone calls or inquiries about the financial condition, the position of the fund. But we, as an office, decided that was something very important to look at, and that was why we did that in Phase 1. So we're not limited to the inquiries that we get, but certainly they help inform us on whether to do an audit.
Ms. Lones-Croft.
Okay, thank you. I'll pass it on to my colleague from Clayton Park West.
Ms. Costanza.
Thank you very much, and finding this really very interesting. In regard to Chapter 1, I'm looking at the way when you go into tests, you have a standard that the government has put for itself, the standard that they're trying to achieve, but do you also look at where they are compared to other provinces and how we compare? I know Nova Scotia has, in regards to immigration, we've been behind, and in the last 5 to 7 years, we've had a huge influx. Are we comparing ourselves in inclusion with just what was standard 10, 15 years ago, or what's the standard right now? And how did you put a level, the baseline, and where you're working from? Thank you.
Mr. Pickup.
So often on audits, the question will come up sort of how are other jurisdictions doing? Is there benchmarking occurring? How do we do compared to others? Those types of discussions come up, in diversity and inclusion. They also come up on other areas. I think what's important for me is we look at what the strategy and the 32 action items. So if there have been significant action items around, for example, benchmarking, trend analysis, doing comparisons, best practicing, going to other jurisdictions to see what worked well and what didn't, that likely would be something we would then look at because it was a key part of the strategy. But here it wasn't, part of the strategy and wasn't something that we therefore picked when we selected half of the items. So it's not something that we would look at. Because again, from an audit perspective, what we're trying to do here is say, did you achieve what you committed to do? Did you achieve the strategy that you put in place? Versus trying to identify, for example, what the strategy ought to be, which is really the business of government.
Ms. Costanza.
Thank you, but I also wonder sometimes in how the departments come up with these strategies, and is that something that you need to audit or not? Is just are you happy in general with the strategy before as the benchmark for starting point?
Mr. Pickup.
So we wouldn't comment on the strategy itself. So as a starting point, we say, okay, this is what the government has intended to do. Did you do what you intended to do? So it's very much about that. Now, having said that, on an audit, if we were looking at key systems and practices on an audit, for example, something separate from this, like let's say if it was a Crown Corporation, an ABC, where strategic planning, setting a strategy was very important. So you were going into a new line of business, for example, where appropriately planning as a system and practice would be critical, then that is something we might look at. Versus a decision, for example, to enter into a certain line of business, which very much might be a policy decision or a political decision that would not fall in under the domain of the auditor.
Ms. Costanza.
Thank you very much. And now I think I have another question in Chapter 3. The decisions for appeals, or the appeals that we were received in compensation, what were the majority of them, the reasons for them? Were they a denial of financial benefit? What kind of the reasons for the appeals that were received, if you don't mind?
Ms. Richardson?
So just what types of appeals they're receiving?
That's right. The majority of them, are they denial? Are they the value, the amount of money that they're receiving that is not satisfactory to the applicant, or what kind of, how many appeals in general? Yeah. How are we doing with the appeals situation?
So in terms of the total number of appeals, we did note that in the report. 26.
Mr. Pickup.
Paragraph 3.26.
Yeah, so in 2016, they received 1,450, in 2017, 1,418. I don't have the exact breakdown in terms of the type of appeal, but we did definitely see a variety. A lot of the appeals that are going through are an appeal to a specific part of the decision. So in a lot of instances, their decision, they might have received a benefit, so their claim was approved, but as you mentioned, perhaps they didn't get the amount of benefit, so they're appealing the calculation of their income, so how that came through, and that kind of comes through in some of our earlier recommendations that we're talking about as well, in terms of if people are waiting to get, if they don't receive that detailed calculation of their benefit, then it's difficult for them to assess themselves, so that could actually result in an appeal just because you don't have the information to even process and understand how it got to that point. But yeah, overall, I don't have necessarily the breakdown, but it was definitely varied. So it was varied from appealing the amount, appealing the overall decision for denial. Definitely a mix.
Ms. Costanza, that ends your time for questioning. We'll now move back to the Liberal Caucus, or the PC Caucus, sorry, with Mr. Hallman.
How much time do I have, Mr. Chair? Sorry.
9 minutes.
9 minutes. All right, let's return to Chapter 2. In the chart above, Section 2.18 on page 35, we can see in the years 2016, 2017, there were 24 bridges in question. 2017, 2018, there were 30, and there were also 30 for the number for 2018, 2019. I'm curious as to why did only 2017, 2018 achieve a 100% completion rate and the other two failed to do so? In the course of your investigation, what was the department's reason for this?
Mr. Hardy.
In terms of the reason as to why they didn't complete the inspection, we weren't given a clear reason as to why it wasn't done. So we were looking to see if the inspection had been completed. These are the results based on that testing, but they didn't give us a clear, it wasn't done because of resourcing, or there was no clear reason as to why it wasn't done. It just wasn't completed.
Mr. Hallman.
I'm curious, in terms of the scope of your investigation with audits, when statements like that are given to your office, I mean, generally, do you do a follow-up question to try to determine the reasoning of why there's gaps? And I realize this is a very general question, but I take it you do follow-up questions to try to determine reasoning. Am I correct in saying that?
Mr. Pickup.
So we have a fancy term for that in the world of audit. It's called root cause analysis. So we do try and do root cause analysis. For example, the example I would give you is somebody went over budget, right? So the easy answer is they went over budget. The root cause might have been that the wrong people were developing the budget. So we do look for root cause analysis. I would refer you to, in this case, for example, one, I know it gets tiring for the ask the department answer, but the thing I want to give you a little more specific on is their response. So in their response, and it may be something in terms of questioning to ask them, they said they're going to determine if additional resources are required to ensure that policy is met. Okay, so it's only a 4-line response on page 36 to 2.3, but that is in there, and they'll review it and deal with it within 24 months. But that may be a line of questioning for the deputy to say, do you need additional resources to do that?
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you comment the extent to which departments that you audit are open to your point of root cause analysis? Do you find there's cooperation when it comes to that depth of investigation for an Auditor General?
Mr. Pickup.
I am absolutely convinced that the departments do want to engage in that root cause analysis discussion. At times, it can be that can be a difficult discussion. It can be difficult to get to what a root cause is, and it's important because it can help a recommendation development that makes a more relevant, a more meaningful recommendation. It probably doesn't change the audit answer. So if you set out to say, did you do A and B? No, you didn't do A and B. So you failed to do A and B. However, where that root cause discussion becomes more important is what are you going to do to fix so that A and B doesn't happen again? And that's where that discussion is needed. So I think, absolutely they are engaged in that discussion. And I think if anything, they want us to hear if they know the answer.
Mr. Hallman.
With respect to that, it was said in the report that 4 of the 14 bridges did not receive verification inspections as required. I'm curious as to whether or not, did you find out why that was the case, or when you began to probe using the root cause analysis, did you get an explanation as to why the verification inspections as required did not occur for 4 of the 14 bridges?
Mr. Pickup.
So the answer I am being told is no, but again, maybe the deputy will have some deeper thoughts on that.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. All right, going further into Chapter 2, into the report, if I've understood correctly, Section 2.23 on page 39 mentions another check required by staff within the department. As stated within the report, failure by the department to monitor warranties could result in the department eventually paying for repairs that a contractor should have corrected under the warranty. Now, I'm curious, when you discovered, I suppose, internal habits like this within the department, do you think giving the department additional funding now to deal with these issues, or do you think they ought to demonstrate, I suppose, a greater attempt at better resource management with their funds?
Mr. Pickup.
So we do these audits and we make the decisions on whether to do these audits, recognizing that issues on funding and how much funding someone has is not within the purview of the auditor. Those are government decisions. Now, having said that, I think all the more a reason, and partially why we put that contextual information, is all the more reason to do your warranty claims, because you do have limited funding, and why would you chance making a warranty claim so that you don't have to spend your own money somewhere down the road? It's not unlike owning a car.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In section 2.25 on page 37, on the bottom of the page, it states that the act of completing the required annual reviews would allow for the department to see whether contractors are meeting with the department's quality standards. Am I correct in saying these required annual reviews that the department, it's not following that none were completed? Am I correct in saying that with respect to the annual reviews?
Mr. Harding.
Just to clarify, 225? Oh, I was looking at the, apologies, I was looking at the wrong paragraph. So these, paragraph 2.25, referring to annual audits that the department completes on significant or major construction projects. So part of that is that they would look at 3 projects that have taken place during a year to look to see if department policies have been followed. I apologize. Would you be able to rephrase or repeat the question that you were?
Mr. Hallman.
So if you go back to section 2.25, it's saying that the act of completing the required annual reviews would allow for the department to see whether contractors are meeting the department's quality standards. I'm curious as to, is this something you would audit in terms of these annual reviews? Is this something the Office of Auditor General would probe into?
Mr. Pickup.
So the point of the question, or the point of why we looked at this was because they had identified this as one of their own control processes. So if they said this was important for them to do it, then we looked at, are you in fact doing it? I do want to, again, refer you back to something because I think it goes to your root cause analysis questioning that you had before. In the response to the recommendation about doing that, and this may be something to probe, it says the department will review to determine if additional resources are required to ensure the files are complete and accurate. So I'm not saying that's the root cause, but I'm saying that this might be something to probe. And this is an example where it can be difficult during an audit to get some of the root cause analysis and discussion and clarity because the organizations may not know themselves at that point, right? So it sounds like they were going to go and do this work. So it may be something worth following up.
Thank you very much. That concludes the time for the PC Caucus. We'll now move to the NDP Caucus and Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. Just one last question for me related to the bridges. It's noted that records that exist are not always clear or consistent in terms of, required maintenance and condition of bridges. And I'm just wondering, Mr. Harding, did you find evidence of existing policy on how records are to be taken and where they are to be stored? Is there a clear process and policy about maintenance records that is not being followed?
Mr. Harding.
And that very much is the reason for our observation in the report, that there wasn't a clear requirement that the records had to be maintained in one location or in one particular format. And that really is the observation that the information is in a variety of formats, a variety of locations, and that introduces some risks of inconsistency or some risks that that information may not be readily available when someone's looking for it.
Ms. Roberts.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to the Workers' Compensation Board report. It was troubling to learn that there have been several breaches of private medical information, including information about medications that the worker making the claim was taking and information about previous illnesses and injuries not related to the claim. It was found that these breaches occurred at both the staff and management level, and the Workers' Compensation Board has said that they will review best practices for vetting sensitive information removal over the next 12 to 24 months. I'm just wondering, if I could get a comment on how confident the Auditor General's Office is that a best practices review will change the attention to detail that seems to be lacking at present.
Mr. Pickup.
So the reason part of the reason why we ask for responses to the recommendations is to help foster a discussion and some accountability discussion as well between people in the legislature and the organizations that we audit. So we don't give, of course, any sort of, advance ruling, advanced assurance to say we think that is likely or not likely. Honestly, we just accept the response as they want to give the response. We encourage some rigor put into those responses. We encourage that if you think it's going to take longer. And then what I like about the time frames being there is so that, you folks can judge and have the discussion if you have a chance to have them here as to whether you think it's reasonable given everything else that they have to do. That really, I think, is a discussion between, the people I report to and in the legislature and the people we audit.
Ms. Roberts.
Thank you very much. In the report, it's noted that several workers' appeals were not processed in line with the Workers' Compensation Board's 90-day target, and that appeals took, in fact, on average, 50 days to even be assigned. And in 4 of 20 appeals with delays that did not appear reasonable, decisions were made between 140 and 458 business days after the notice of appeal was filed. That seems like a very unreasonable amount of time to have to wait almost 2 calendar years to get a response to an appeal. In, again, 4 of 20 appeals within the sample works out to 20% of cases facing an unreasonable wait time. Based on this sample, Ms. Richardson or Mr. Pickup, do you think it's fair to assume that 20% of the total appeals before the WCB may be subject to unreasonable delays?
Ms. Richardson?
So I wouldn't say that we could necessarily extrapolate it to say that, but what we would be able to say is that there are clear gaps in their processes that are allowing those unreasonable delays to occur. And so it would be reasonable to expect that there are certainly other unreasonable delays within the total population. I think that, what is also important, so about those when we're talking unreasonable delays, that those 4 specifically, so there were other delays where we could see, commentary, justification. So there were delays as well, but we could see the rationale, we could see what was being looked for, what information. So that's one issue, but in these particular issues, there were just large gaps of empty time when nothing was occurring. And so the lack of the process to be able to identify and ensure that's not occurring could certainly allow many more to slip through those cracks to have those extended wait times.
Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. What happens to a claimant during that large gap?
Ms. Richardson.
They would just be waiting. That would be what would be occurring. And so that also ties back to items like the complaint process. So the complaints that we did see often were related to timeliness. So having all of those processes, there's many processes there that need to function properly to ensure that those claimants aren't just waiting for long periods of time with also no avenue to try to ensure that that process is remaining timely.
Ms. Roberts.
This is a system where we in our constituency offices do get calls, and I have found that those calls have been some of the most, fraught with emotion and real sense. And I'm sure that, if you're getting those calls, it's coming from that same place of real frustration and sense that one's personal agency is being just completely thwarted by an institution that is not responsive. And I know that some of those individuals would suspect that those large gaps, where a file has just been allowed to, sit somewhere, is evidence that there's an intention to slow the process in order to reduce costs. Would you have anything to comment on, in response to that, which is a conclusion that one could draw?
Mr. Pickup.
So it's not a conclusion that, sort of we would draw on that. I would bring you back to the responses to say, okay, in the responses, what do they mean? So for example, a response might indicate we've hired an additional hearing officer in that case to deal with some of this. So maybe a fair question to the board is, why did it take an audit for you to need to know that? Or on the complaints process, or on a number of these things where they are going to look at best practices. I think it's fair question to the organization we audited to say, why is that only coming out of an audit?
Ms. Roberts.
Ms. Richardson, the audit notes the lack of a formal structure to the complaints process. Can you say more about what that process currently looks like?
Ms. Richardson.
So we do provide a bit of detail on that in the report. So the current complaint process is singularly managed by one person. So there's one point of contact upon which you register a complaint, and that would be the person who would log the complaint, follow up, validate the complaint, follow up, ensure that it's taken care of at the management side and filtered down to the caseworker. What we found is that there was no process in place to formally document all of those actions. So that was one of our main concerns is there was no approach to ensure that, it's clearly documented what is the complaint, who is the complainant, when was it received, what action was taken, that whole process. And that would be an expectation that we would have for a well-defined, fulsome complaint process.
That concludes time for questioning for the NDP Caucus. We'll now move to the Liberal Caucus and Mr. Jessom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, could someone expand on what the intended role between government and the Workers' Compensation Board is? What's some background on the working relationship, the attention to the working relationship between government and the board?
Ms. Richards.
So the Workers' Compensation Board has a reporting relationship to the Department of Labor and Advanced Education. So that is not a governance role, that's a reporting relationship. So direction is provided to the Workers' Compensation Board solely through legislation, so the Workers' Compensation Act. So in order to direct the Workers' Compensation Board to perform some action or abide by some new rule that would come through the Workers' Compensation Act. However, they do have to report to the Department of Labor and Advanced Education. Does that?
Mr. Jessom.
So just to clarify, to operationalize any of the changes that are proposed or considered, does that come from the board or does that come from the government?
Ms. Richardson.
So changes that the government would propose. So the board they have, their policy committee, so they can make changes to policy that falls within the parameters of the Workers' Compensation Act for government to, create change with the Workers' Compensation Board. If it was outside of the parameters of the Act, they would need to make those changes to legislation. Is that?
Mr. Jessom.
Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to identify where, who or what. We have these boards that operate and make decisions to some extent, but then there's the oversight provided by government. So I'm trying to identify, if we're talking about there's a gap in some of the reporting or what have you, what is it, the government or the board that operationalizes a decision to provide a definitive way to report?
Mr. Pickup.
So in this case, for example, all of these recommendations are within the control of the Workers' Compensation Board. So, and if you look at the responses, nowhere do they say we need the government to do A, B, and C. And when we set out to do these audits, we do it in the context of the policy and legal and regulatory framework and environment that we're in. So we are in no way trying to suggest that any type of policy, regulations, laws, in terms of how the Workers' Compensation Board operates and its arm's length position to a certain extent from the government should be changed. It's all within the control of the board.
Mr. Jessup.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify that was the case. Related but unrelated, I guess. Can either of you provide a comment or some comments on when the last time the Workers' Compensation Board was audited and any type of background on that particular audit?
Ms. Richardson.
So the last time the Workers' Compensation Board was audited was, I believe, in 2000. It was a while ago. And so obviously there has been a significant amount of change within the Workers' Compensation Board since that time. So we really went into this audit with, a fresh perspective of looking at their current environment, their current context through our planning process and the challenges that the organization is faced with today.
Mr. Jessup.
So when you reference change, do you mean with respect to composition or operations of the board, or like I guess I'm just trying to identify specifically whether if this is what the report is today, was there a similar scenario in 2000 and kind of like what's been prohibitive to get to a point of improvement over the past 20 years?
Mr. Pickup.
So in terms of the previous audit that was done, about 20 years ago, that would have been, subject to whatever follow-up and processes there were at the time. Now, having said that, that would have informed us to some extent to say what happened to that as a result. But I think the significance of the issues, the inherent risks around the Workers' Compensation Board was enough to generate our interest in doing the audit. And the other thing I would remind you is this was phase 2. We did do looking at the governance and the sustainability in terms of the funding last year, I guess it was, that we reported on that as well.
Mr. Jessup.
Okay, thank you. Let's kind of get into the actual particulars here. When we talk about, and I guess I'll just cite the example that I have here, 3.12, 9 out of 20 claims regarding permanent injuries or permanent, I guess, compensation decisions not completed in a timely manner. Can you expand on, and I'll add the context that to me it would seem that there's some merit in delaying any type of examination particular to a decision to be made with respect to a permanent decision having to do with injuries. I think, like you have, if you're in a car accident, for example, you have up to 2 years to make that claim. And I think, there's some validity in taking your time to decide how your body's going to react or improve, or, how therapies go. So when we're talking about a permanent decision, is there, and I would also add that there's been an identification in the report that there is short-term funding enabled. So I'm just trying to understand, is there any merit behind those delays, or what did you find when you looked at that?
Ms. Richardson.
So just to clarify, you're speaking merit in terms of that it could potentially, like additional time could potentially, so there's several kind of parts to the permanent impairment assessment process. So the first part would be the practitioner that the worker is working with would essentially notify the workers' compensation board that they believe maximum recovery has been reached. So this would have been after a significant likely period of time that you've been following a return to work plan or a plan to achieve peak recovery. So this wouldn't be immediately after you filed a claim or anything like that. And at that point, that's when the caseworker would refer that to the internal medical advisor to confirm that they agree, yes, that we agree that that's probably reasonable, that they've reached maximum recovery, at which point it would then be sent for an assessment to determine the degree of that permanent impairment. So I think that it's the process is has a time lapse which is reasonable.
Mr. Jessup, 30 seconds.
Oh, God, okay. Is there an opportunity to, like, we talk about the internal medical advisors that are available to support a claim or a process. Is there an opportunity for an external, I think it would provide a lot of comfort, I guess, for an individual to provide their own assessor? Is that possible at all?
Ms. Richardson.
So depending on the scenario, there can be external medical advisors involved in a process. We do refer in the report to kind of an independent panel that was proposed to be established in legislation, which hasn't occurred. But internally, they do have this internal medical advisor process. And, if there are disagreements between, for instance, the external practitioner and the internal medical advisor, there are processes in place for that. So the internal medical advisor doesn't necessarily have, last and final say on the situation. There are multiple levels of consultation.
Thank you very much. That concludes questioning. If you would now like to make a few closing remarks, you can do so. Mr. Pickup.
Very short closing remarks. I want to thank you for your questions and for inviting us here today and your interest in our work as we are here to serve you and all members of the legislature and the work that you do. I want to thank the folks with me today, but equally important is the folks back in the office who work on these audits and who are now busy working on other audits, and equally to the 6 organizations across the broader public sector that we worked with here, that we audited here, for their excellent cooperation. The cooperation is amazing, and while we have, a very independent job to do, we do get very professional responses. And now I am hopeful that given the 27 recommendations we made and the nature of the responses, which have very specific timelines, which in very few exceptions exceed 24 months, I hope now that the most important thing that will happen is the action to address the recommendations, and that's why follow-up is so important and seeing these things done. Doing these audits are great, getting agreements to the recommendations are great, but the greatest part and the most important part, frankly, is the carry-through of government to make the changes for better government for Nova Scotians, which is what drives all of us to do this work that we do. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We do have some committee business we'll continue on with now. If you guys have looked at your package, there is some correspondence there from the Department of Fisheries and Aquaculture and from the Auditor General of Nova Scotia. If we've all had a chance to read it, I'd like to just move that we accept that correspondence as is, and it can be posted or done what needs to be done. Second item on the agenda is the Subcommittee on Agenda and Procedures record of decision from the June 5th, 2019 meeting. I would ask for a motion to accept and approve that record of decision. Any discussion? Ms. Roberts.
Sorry, I was going to move that we accept the slate of topics as proposed.
Mr. McKay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I call the committee's attention to the last 2 topics. which, although came out of subcommittee, did not do so on a unanimous basis. And I believe we have to look at these separately rather than taking the full slate.
Mr. Hallman.
With respect to my colleague, perhaps then we can find an alternative topic with respect to the last two on the list here. And certainly, I believe the most pressing issue impacting our province is doctor recruitment. We have a Auditor General's report of 2017, the fall 2017 report, and if, of course, we are going to be, if you've now limited the scope of this committee to AG reports, then let's follow through on that. And I see this as an opportunity, to your point, Mr. McKay, that perhaps we can substitute that topic of doctor recruitment for one of the two topics here. And that topic of doctor recruitment, of course, from the 2017 fall report of the Auditor General.
Before we go any further, there was a motion on the floor to accept it as presented. We'll deal with that motion first, then we can deal with the other motions after that. So to accept the agenda as presented, all those in favour of the motion? Aye. Contrary-minded? Okay, now we'll move on and we'll do each one individually. Topic of the Public Service Commission, Department of Agriculture, Department of Community Service, Diversity and Inclusion in the Public Service, May 2019, report to the Auditor General. All those in favour? Contrary-minded? Motion's carried. Second item, selection and quality management of bridge projects in Central and Western Districts, May 2019, report of the Auditor General, Chapter 2. All those in favour of the motion? Aye. Contrary-minded? Carried. Third, Workers' Compensation Board, Claims Management, May 2019 report of the Auditor General, Chapter 3. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Contrary-minded? Oh, and there's the second part of that too, I'm sorry. The Workers' Compensation Board, Governance and Long-Stand, Chapter 2 and 3, or Chapter 2 for the second part. Workers' Compensation Board Claims, May 29th report, Auditor General, Chapter 3, and there's Workers' Compensation, Governance and Long-Term Sustainability, December 18 report, Chapter 3. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Contrary-minded? That one's carried. Department of Transportation Infrastructure, use of P3 for twinning the highway between Antigonish and Pictou. Ms. Roberts.
This is a topic that I put forward at the subcommittee. Members of the committee may remember that the Auditor General did an extensive audit report on the use of P3 models in building schools in Nova Scotia that found that had many negative implications for value for public dollars. And we now see a whole slate of different infrastructure builds using a P3 model despite some of the findings of that report, and that is the rationale behind putting forward this topic, because it's certainly very timely.
Mr. Holland.
Well, I appreciate the rationale for that topic. I feel the most pressing issue impacting our province is that of doctor recruitment. I see this now as an opportunity for us to put forward that topic based on the Auditor General's fall report of 2017. In terms of visiting this topic, this is something we could look at a future date in terms of P3 between Antigonish and Pictou. But certainly in terms of topics I think that are of the utmost urgency to Nova Scotians, doctor recruitment is there, and this provides us an opportunity to bring that topic forward based on an Auditor General's report.
Ms. Lawrence-Croft.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Keeping with our best practices and studying and discerning Auditor General's reports, I believe our caucus would be willing to take this topic of Department of Transportation, Infrastructure and Renewal with the twinning of the highway between Antigonish and Pictou to resources and economic development, and we would be willing to make a motion for that.
So all those in favour of P3 twinning coming to public accounts? Contrary-minded? Motion's carried. Next, procurement process for the art gallery. All those, Ms. Lawrence-Croft.
We again would be willing to have this topic taken to Rural Resources and Economic Development, and would make a motion to send a
It's not the
letter.
motion we made right now. The motion is, are we going to take it for public accounts?
Oh, okay. Sorry.
All those in favor of the motion of procurement going to public accounts, say aye. Contrary-minded? Motion is defeated. Mr. Hallman, you had another proposal to put
Well, with
forward.
respect to this, that topic, again, here's another opportunity. We can bring topic of doctor recruitment to public accounts based on the Auditor General's report of 2017. It's a great opportunity for all of us to discuss this very important topic.
Mr. McKay.
2 points to Mr. Hallman's motion here. Firstly, we've already had the topic of doctor recruitment here at public accounts. And so I think that's not the best use of it. But secondly, if it was to be discussed, this should be referred to the Health Committee, which was set up specifically to deal with these sorts of things in a fully open and transparent manner.
Ms. Roberts?
I was simply going to point out that we did call the topic and have it at committee after that audit. So it was here in December of 2017.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With respect to that, at this stage, Public Accounts is here to talk about Auditor General reports. It's a report that is important. This is a topic that's important. So I think we should do what we said we're going to do, look at Auditor General reports. And here is also a report in line with the most pressing issue impacting our province, doctor recruitment. Let's embrace this opportunity to talk to the department about the efforts being made to attract and retain doctors in our province.
All those in favor of the motion bringing doctor recruitment back into public accounts, please say aye. Contrary-minded? Motion is defeated. Ms. Lawrence-Croft, you had another for the procurement of the art gallery.
Yes, Mr. Chair. My motion is for the Public Accounts Committee to write a letter to the Resources and Economic Development Committee and encourage the committee to request officials from TIR be scheduled at a future meeting to discuss the use of P3s for twinning on the highways.
That motion's already been carried. We've already approved that for public accounts.
Sorry, the art gallery, sorry. Wrong one, my phone moved, sorry. Request that officials from TIR and CCH be scheduled at a future meeting to discuss the art gallery project.
Any discussion? All those in favor of the motion? Contrary-minded? Motion's carried. Next item on the agenda is the endorsement of the Auditor General's recommendations. The committee has adopted a practice of formally endorsing AG recommendations. A list of the recommendations made in the 2019 report was provided to members. I'd ask for a motion to endorse those recommendations. Mr. Jessup.
Thank you. Through the chair, I move that the Public Accounts Committee formally accept and endorse recommendations in the May 2019 report of the Auditor General that have been accepted by the audited departments or agencies, and ask that those departments and agencies commit to and take responsibility for full and timely implementation of the recommendations accepted by those departments and agencies.
Any discussion? All those in favor of the motion? Contrary-minded? Motion is carried. Last item on the agenda is attendance at the CCPAC conference. At the last meeting, information was provided about the conference to members for their information. Ms. Roberts inquired whether a second member could attend should no members from one of the other parties on the committee attend. An inquiry was made, and once it is known who will be attending and should there be a caucus not represented, the request can be then made to the Speaker for consideration as an information piece. There's no further business. The next meeting is July 10th here in the chamber. The witness, as we've discussed, will be called and determined by the clerk. So we'll adjourn, and next meeting July 10th at 9 a.m. Thank you very much. Have a good day.